Alright, so this video is going to deal with understanding what are called phylogenetic trees, and the ability to actually construct and read these is really important on the AP Biology exam. Another term for a phylogenetic tree, or you'll sometimes see it, a cladogram. There is a slight difference between them. Phylogenetic trees usually just look at evolutionary relationships, whereas cladograms have traits put on them. And we're going to talk about like how do you construct them, what do they mean, and so that when we look at this cladogram that we can see here, right, it shows relatedness. So the way you can tell relatedness is how far down, so all of these organisms you can see at the top exist. Where did they share a most recent common ancestor? Now, Charles Darwin, aside from his theory of natural selection, he also came up with a theory of descent with modification, which talked about how there was a universal common ancestor of all life at one point, and that there's certain individual species that are more closely related than others are. So you can see here rodents and primates are really closely related to each other, because in terms of the organisms that are on this tree, because they have hair and fur, right? Birds and reptiles actually are more closely related to each other, but all birds, reptiles, rodents, and primates shared a common ancestor at this point in the past. And amphibians and reptiles, birds, rodents, and primates all shared a common ancestor back here. And then fish and everything else shared a common ancestor back here. And you can kind of see how there's like traits that were put on, or characteristics that were put on when they evolved kind of in the history of life. You can see like all of those things, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, rodents, primates, are all eukaryotes. So eukaryotes evolved earlier on, because everything above that point is a eukaryote. But notice everything, so then all of these species before that are, actually they're all vertebrates too, I'm sorry. So they're also all vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and rodents. But once four limbs evolved, notice fish aren't there anymore. They're not part of that, but everything after that point had four limbs. And then we have the amniotic egg is the next thing that evolved, because amphibians don't have that. We'll talk about that when we get into Earth's history. So one second. Cat was nibbling on her cat food bag. Okay. So, but eggshells, look, there's hard eggs in both reptiles and birds. Rodents and primates have amniotic eggs, but they're inside of them, right? That's like the amniotic sac that's inside of the uterus of a mammal. So you can kind of see how this kind of all breaks down. And the common ancestor, I said, of all things that are on here would be at this point right here. So phylogenetic trees, as I mentioned, are visual representations of relatedness. They're basically like a giant family tree, but it goes back millions and millions and sometimes billions of years. Right, as I mentioned like when you move up through the branches, we kind of just talked about that. It represents time, but it's not, it's a very loose form of time. Some phylogenetic trees or cladograms will have time on them, but most of them will not. So just everything that exists at the end here exists currently on this one. This is like the tree of life. This is all living things. It includes prokaryotes, which are archaea and bacteria. And then there's also the eukaryota, which include everything. And here we are right here on this small little branch. And most things that you think of as animals, or as, as living things, exist right in the small area, plants, fungi, right? And there's all of this other stuff that we don't really even talk about. We do sometimes, right, but not that often. So when you read these things, whether they're, because a lot of times they won't put real species on there, they'll just put like letters, and you have to determine like what's most closely related to what. So A and B are really closely related, D and E are really closely related. As you can see here, they share a common ancestor, A and B, at X. C, D, and E all share a common ancestor at Y. But one thing you want to understand about that common ancestor of all those species, it doesn't exist anymore. It deviated, as you can see, into C and then a separate population, and then that separate population deviated into D and E. That Y species, that common ancestor, doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't, like C, D, and E don't look anything like their common ancestor in the past. And that's a common thing when people talk about like, oh, human beings are related to chimpanzees. Yeah, that's our most closely related living relative, but the common ancestor of both of us wasn't a chimpanzee, nor was it a human. It looked completely different. If you hear the term clade, a clade on a cladogram is just what's called a monophyletic grouping. A monophyletic grouping is a group of all species that came from one common ancestor. Then they'll ask you to determine that on the AP Bio exam. So like this clade, turtles, lizards, crocodiles, and birds are all one. That's considered a monophyletic clade. When you look at a clade, my cat's back trying to eat her food again. Get out of here. Hey, now she's... No. Yeah. If you look at a monophyletic group, the group that is least related to all the other ones, as you can see here, mammals, that's called what's called the outgroup. The outgroup is the group that is least related to all of the other ones on the phylogenetic tree. A paraphyletic grouping does include individuals from a common ancestor, but it excludes some of the groups or species that are on it. So for example, reptiles, we don't consider all amniota, you wouldn't consider all amniota reptiles because mammals and birds are both amniota. We've disqualified them from the reptiles. So it's only certain groups that are considered to be members of the reptile group, but they all do share a common ancestor. We call that being paraphyletic. And then there's polyphyletic. That is not based at all on evolutionary relationships. That has to do with some shared characteristics, like mammals and birds are both warm-blooded. They evolved those traits independently as an example of convergent evolution, but they didn't have, their common ancestor back here was cold-blooded. So it evolved separately in two separate lineages. So again, it's on a characteristic that is not based on evolutionary relatedness. So here's showing you the difference between the three. There's monophyletic, a paraphyletic on the outside, and then polyphyletic in the middle, again, having to do with traits specifically. And you can see how complicated these things can actually get. Like these are, I think, species of birds, right? These are all different birds and the evolutionary relationships associated with different species of birds. All right, I'm going to have you look at this question based on morphological characteristics for the phylogenetic tree above. The phylogenetic tree above has been developed for species 1, 2, 3, and 4. Another important thing I do want to let you know that you can always flip around a node. It does not change the evolutionary relationship. So if I switched 1 and 2 on their positions on here, it doesn't matter. If I switch 3 and 4 in their positions, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the evolutionary relationship whatsoever. DNA sequencing has recently been completed for a particular gene found in all 4 species. The sequencing will provide additional information for answering which of the following questions. Now, I told you about that flipping along the node for a reason. Is species 1 the common ancestor of species 2 and 3? Is 1 the common ancestor of 2 and 3? Now, I want you to think about that for a second. That shouldn't make any sense to you because the common ancestor of 2 and 3, we have to follow it back. It existed right here at this node. It's called right here. Does that common ancestor exist anymore? No, it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. It's separated into these different branches and lineages. It's either 1, 2, or 3. Those are all 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all ancestors that came from this node, and that common ancestor was the original ancestor, and then they all branched off from that point. Does species 1 contain the greatest number of vestigial structures? We can't determine that. Like getting different like DNA sequencing based on, so they made this cladogram or this phylogenetic tree based on morphological characteristics, like that's physical characteristics. Now we have DNA evidence to know actual relatedness. What can we figure out about that? So let's look at C. Are species 3 and 4 the most closely related? Yeah, we can figure that out. Because maybe based on characteristics, we put them like this, but maybe 2 and 3 are actually more closely related when we don't take into characteristics and we just look at the DNA, because the morphological evidence is going to be the best evidence. And then D, should species positions of 3 and 4 be reversed? Remember, that doesn't matter. You can always flip around the node. It doesn't change their relationship. So the answer to this one is C. This cladogram shows shared traits amongst 4 plant taxa. Based on the cladogram, which of the following are the traits shared between ferns and pines? So you want to look here. Where's ferns and pines, right? Ferns, pines, right? Wood, seeds. Pines don't have that. Or, excuse me, pines have that, but ferns have that, don't have that. What all of them have are xylem and embryo, right? Because xylem, embryo evolved first, then xylem evolved, which is the way plant gets water, and then ferns don't have xylem. Notice how they branch, or excuse me, why do I keep saying that? Ferns don't have wood, right? They have xylem, but they don't have wood. They branched off before wood evolved. But pines have wood, pines have seeds, ferns do not. So what are the things that ferns and pines share? They both have xylem, and they both have embryos. So the answer to this again is C. All right. The figure shows a phylogenetic tree of various members of the order Proboscidae, which are like old elephants, right? Which include modern elephants. Which of the following claims is best supported by the information in the figure? So now you have to check each one. Notice how this one has time on it, right? There is evolutionary time on here. That's going to come into play. So let's check each answer. The Asian and African elephants are the most closely related species shown on the tree. Okay, so let's find Asian and African elephants. Are they the most closely related? No, because they share a common ancestor here. The mammoth is actually more closely related to the Asian elephant than the African elephant is to the Asian elephant, so that discounts A. B. The mammoth diverged from its most recent common ancestor with the African elephants before the mastodon. Okay, so let's see, the mammoth, here it is right here, diverged from its most recent common ancestor with the African elephant, which would be right here. I'm going to put the pointer right there. More recently, before the mastodon, diverged from its most recent common ancestor. I can't speak. Most recent common ancestor with stegodons. So notice that they're here, right? So there's our 2 points. Now we have to figure out, does that relationship make sense? The mammoth diverged before the mastodon. No, it didn't. It diverged after, right? Because this is in time. This is the past in that direction. So it wasn't. It happened after that. So you discredit B. C. The mastodon and stegodon diverged from their common ancestor 2 million years ago. Mastodon, stegodon, 2 million years ago? No, they diverged from their common ancestor way longer than that. Probably closer to 20 million years ago, based on this scale. The common ancestor of the African elephant and the mastodon is the Paleomastodon. Common ancestor, let's find them, African elephant here. And the mastodon, which is here, is the Paleomastodon. Notice you have to follow it back to where their lineages finally match up. Boom, that's the right answer. D is the right answer to this. All right, something like this gets a little bit more dicey, but it's about the number of differences. Always, sometimes they'll do DNA sequences, sometimes they'll do protein sequences, sometimes or amino acid sequences. It just depends. So remember, the idea is that the more differences there are, which is usually what the number means, more differences, that means the more distantly related they are to the other species. So this says scientists are interested in determining the evolution of 7 lizard species found on different islands of the Canary Island group. They isolated DNA from individuals of each species and sequenced the mitochondrial gene that codes for cytochrome B. And who does that mitochondrial gene come from? Their mothers, because they write in the eggs. Anyway, the number of genetic differences between species are shown on the table below. Based on the data in the table, which of the following lizard species are the most closely related? So what you look for, remember, this is about genetic differences. So the lower the number, the more closely related. So clearly here, I look at F and G as being very closely related because there's only 2 differences. But what AP is doing to you, look at the choices. F and G are not a choice of the ones that they gave you. So you start to question yourself here. You shouldn't. You still follow the same logic, but let's go to the next closest. What's the next closest to species in terms of the number of differences? I see D and E have only 4 differences, and D and E are a choice on here. The answer is going to be this one, B. Another question I could ask you, which species is the outgroup, the one that's least closely related to all the rest? What has the most differences compared to all the other species? Species A. Another thing I want you to look at that, because sometimes you get confused, people get confused with what this is showing. So species A and species A are not going to have a difference. Here we have species B and species A have 34 differences. Species A and C have 39. D and A, 38. D and E, 38. E and A, 38. A and F, 43. A and G, 47. So lots of differences between A and all the rest. That puts them in the out group. That's the one that's going to be all the way by themselves. Species B would then kind of be next, right? You see that, how species B is not very closely related to the other one. So species B would kind of be the next one on that tree. But we're going to practice these in class a little bit more. It's not just these questions that we're going to do. Okay? So if you have any questions, come see